Hi, I'm Joshua.
And I'm Angel.
We're going to be covering 2.2 nutrient cycle in the ecosystem. The Earth's biosphere is like a giant sealed terrarium, or as a box for a simpler term, and in which all nutrients and all waste are constantly recycled. There are three types of cycles: the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles, moved throughout the different ecosystems. Human activities such as land clearing, agriculture, and industry, and motorized transportation can affect nutrient cycles.
For each nutrient cycles, we are going to teach you what they are, where they are stored, and how they are cycled in short and long term, and how human activities affect the cycles. Nutrients are accumulated in Earth's atmosphere, oceans, and land masses, referred to as stores. Biotic and abiotic processes cause nutrients to flow into and out of stores, creating nutrient cycles.
In the ecosystem, there are five chemical elements that limit the amount and types of life possible in an ecosystem: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. The health of an ecosystem depends on the balance of these nutrients, and so we are going to look at how carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles move these nutrients through land and water ecosystems.
The carbon cycle. The element of carbon is an essential component for plants and animals to sustain life. And so, carbon is always being recycled by a series of reactions called the carbon cycle. How are carbon being stored?
Carbon can be stored in short and long terms. Short-term stores of carbon are found in vegetation, ocean plants, animals, decaying organic material in soil, and in the atmosphere known as carbon dioxide. Long-term stores are found in the deep ocean as dissolved carbon dioxide and remain for 500 years till it's released again, and on land they are found in coal, oil, and gas deposits which are formed millions of years ago.
And on the largest long-term stores are found in marine sediment and sedimentary rock. Sedimentation is a process in which soil particles and decaying organic matter of dissolved carbonate from marine organisms can accumulate in layers on the ground or at the bottom of the large bodies of water, contributing to the formation of sedimentary rocks.
How are carbon being cycled?
There are natural processes that move carbon through ecosystems that include photosynthesis, cellular respiration, decomposition, ocean processes, and events such as volcanic eruptions and forest fires. Through photosynthesis, carbon, in the form of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, enters through the leaves of plants and reacts with water in the presence of sunlight to produce carbohydrates and oxygen. This is the equation on how to represent photosynthesis.
Cellular respiration is a process in which both plants and animals release CO2 back into the atmosphere by converting carbohydrates and oxygen into CO2 and water. CO2 is released as a waste product such as manure and such. Cellular respiration can be represented by this equation. Decomposing is another way for carbon to go back to the ecosystem. It breaks down dead organic matter into CO2 and then released back into the atmosphere.
Another way carbon goes back to the ecosystem is by ocean processes. This would include the process of ocean mixing. It moves carbon throughout the world's oceans and pumps more carbon into the ocean. Then it is released back into the atmosphere. Lastly, carbon can go back to the atmosphere by erupting volcanoes and large-scale forest fires. By erupting volcanoes, carbon dioxide is released, and for forest fires, carbon dioxide is also slowly released from decomposing trees. How do human activities affect the carbon cycle?
Human activities such as industry and motorized transportation, land clearing, agriculture, and urban expansion have changed the natural carbon cycle. Carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere has increased over 30%, and with so much carbon being released so quickly into the atmosphere from these activities, that the natural carbon cycle can no longer move all of it into other stores.
Lastly, clearing land for agriculture and the expansion of cities reduces the total amount of carbon taken from the atmosphere by plants during photosynthesis. The nitrogen cycle.
Nitrogen is an essential element for plants and animals which is needed to make protein and DNA. For animals, protein are essential for muscle functions and many other life functions. For plants, nitrogen is good for growth. How are nitrogen being stored?
The largest store of nitrogen is the atmosphere, where it exists as nitrogen gas. Other major stores of nitrogen include oceans and organic matter in soil. In land ecosystems, living organisms, lakes, and marshes also store nitrogen, but much smaller amounts. What are the ways nitrogen can be cycled?
Most organisms cannot use this type of nitrogen gas in the atmosphere, and so there are four processes in the nitrogen cycle in which three makes nitrogen available and one of them returns nitrogen.
Nitrogen fixation is one of the process where it converts nitrogen gas into nitrate and ammonium, that are compounds that are usable by plants. Nitrogen fixation can occur in three ways: in the atmosphere, soil, and water. Atmospheric nitrogen fixation occurs when nitrogen gas is converted into nitrate and other nitrogen-containing compounds by lightning. Nitrogen fixation in the soil occurs when nitrogen gas is converted into ammonium by the bacteria during the decomposing process. Certain species of bacteria, called nitrogen-fixing bacteria, play a significant role in nitrogen fixation. Certain species of cyanobacteria in aquatic ecosystems also fix nitrogen into ammonium. Cyanobacteria are blue-green bacteria that manufacture their own food during photosynthesis. Nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria make these nitrogen compounds available to plants in the surface waters of oceans, wetlands, and lakes.
In a process called nitrification, ammonium is converted into nitrate. Nitrification takes place in two stages and involves certain soil bacteria known as nitrifying bacteria. In the first stage of nitrification, certain species of nitrifying bacteria convert ammonium into nitrite. In the second stage, different species of nitrifying bacteria convert nitrite into nitrate. In another process, nitrates can be utilized by plants and animals through root uptake. Uptake is when usable forms of nitrogen are taken up by plant roots and incorporated into plant proteins. When animals eat plants, they then incorporate nitrogen into their tissue, and when they die, types of decomposer bacteria and fungi are able to take the nitrogen trapped in the proteins and DNA of dead organisms and convert it back to ammonium.
The last process in which nitrogen is returned to the atmosphere is called denitrification. Denitrification involves certain bacteria known as denitrifying bacteria. Denitrifying bacteria converts nitrate back into nitrogen gas. How is nitrogen removed from the ecosystem?
Nitrogen is removed from the ecosystem by having excess nitrate and ammonium that are not taken up by plant mixed with rainwater and are washed from soil into groundwater and streams. Unused nitrogen may settle into oceans, lake, or river bottoms in sediments. Eventually, these sediments will form rock and nitrogen will not be available. Only after centuries of weathering will the nitrogen be released into the water. How do human activities affect the nitrogen cycle?
Human activities have doubled the available nitrogen in the biosphere. Millions of tons of nitrogen are added into the atmosphere as a result of fossil fuel consumption, in the use of transportation and combustion in power plants and processes such as sewage treatment. Clearing and burning forests and grasslands also releases trapped nitrogen into the atmosphere, which would cause acid precipitation and may cause damage to forests.
Chemical fertilizers also contain nitrogen, which escapes into the atmosphere or gets washed or leached from the soil into lakes and streams. And lastly, high levels of nitrogen can cause eutrophication, the process of having too many nutrients, and can cause increase of algae growth in water ecosystems which deprives the aquatic organisms of sunlight and oxygen. The phosphorus cycle.
Phosphorus carries energy to plant and animal cells. Phosphorus in plants contributes to the growth, and in humans, phosphorus works with calcium in the development of strong bone tissues.
How are phosphorus being stored? Phosphorus are not stored in the atmosphere like carbon or nitrogen, but trapped in phosphate that makes up phosphate rock and ocean sediment. How can phosphorus be cycled?
Phosphorus can be cycled in the ecosystem through withering, which is the process of breaking down rock into smaller fragments, and through withering, phosphate is being released into the soil. Chemical and physical withering releases the phosphate from long-term stores and into the soil. Organisms take up phosphorus, and when they die, decomposers return phosphorus to the soil. Excess phosphorus settles on floors of lakes and oceans, eventually forming sedimentary rocks. It then remains trapped for millions of years until it is exposed through geologic uplift or mountain building. How do human activities affect the phosphorus cycle?
Commercial fertilizers, phosphate-containing detergents, animal wastes from large-scale livestock farming, some industrial waste, and untreated human sewage all enter waterways through runoff and leaching, contributing additional phosphate to the phosphorus cycle. Also, with additional phosphorus, it can negatively affect species that are sensitive to an overload of this nutrient. For example, too much phosphorus can cause fish deaths. Phosphate can also be reduced by slash and burn forest clearance, as phosphate in the trees enters the soil as ash and the leaches out of the soil and settles on the bottom of the lake and oceans unavailable for humans. Through the effects of human activities on the nutrient cycles such as land clearing, agriculture, urban expansion, mining, industry, and motorized transportation, it can affect the nutrient cycle by increasing the amount of nutrients in the cycle faster than natural biotic and abiotic processes that can move them back to the stores.
Over time, as a result of these activities, it can have significant effects on the environment, such as changing the biodiversity in specific environments. In this section, you have learned 3 nutrient cycles on how they operate and how they have been affected by human activities. Thank you for watching.